Welcome to another episode of the BS Podcast, the show that looks at how behavioural change insights are being applied in the wild. Episodes feature renowned behavioural experts across industries and organisations, from management and marketing to policy and public health, and more. Let's dive in and see what all the BS is about. Here's your host from The Behaviourist, Nick Hobson.
April is a behavioral consulting lead at Cowry, where she helps clients solve business problems using behavioral science. April has been studying the field of human behavior for nearly a decade and holds degrees in psychology and behavior change. At the University of St. Andrews, she focused on how evolutionary forces have shaped modern-day behavior and conducted research on facial perception. During her master's degree at UCL, she wrote a thesis on how behavioral science could be used to enhance cybersecurity in the Internet of Things. Most recently, April co-authored the book Ripple with Jez Groom, a former guest on the show. And that book brings to life the idea of how small nudges from behavioral science can snowball into big effects for businesses. April, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Nick. It's a pleasure to be here.
And first off, congratulations on the fairly recent book release.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been a really exciting process. It's just a shame, I suppose, it's coming out right in the midst of our lockdown. So we plan to do all sorts of things to go and promote it and do a big book launch at our offices in central London. But we've just had to roll with the punches and kind of do some of it virtually. So we've got very well acquainted with presenting on video calls to lots of people that we can't see. But yeah, it's been a really, really great process, and really excited that it's out in the world.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I did join the one sort of virtual launch sessions, which was really good at. I've not heard of the program you guys used, but it allowed people to sort of sit at different virtual tables, and you could break out into different rooms. What was that called again?
Yeah, exactly. It was this platform that one of our associates at Cowry pointed us towards. Actually, it's called Remo, and I think it's quite a new. I actually don't know, but it seems like quite a new platform. And they must have just been rubbing their hands together when we all started working remotely, because it must have done wonders for their business, like Zoom. But it was a really, really cool platform for because I mean part of the problem with holding events virtually, I think, is that you don't get those kind of those interesting conversations with like random people when you go to an event in real life. So it kind of it tries to simulate that. So you go in and you sit down at these little tables, and then if you're not enjoying the conversation, you can just leave, double click on another table. But yeah, it's worth checking out, Remo.
Yeah, definitely going to. Especially, I know myself and a lot of other folks in the behavior change world are, of course, doing a lot of sessions and workshops online. So any sort of different resources, and I know I'm using Zoom quite often, and there's which I didn't even know, and maybe they've added this since after the whole thing has happened with lockdown and self-isolation, but where you can embed like different polling and surveys, so as a way to engage, your colleagues or your clients or whomever it is.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting. Well, of course, it's an interesting time, but for us behavioral scientists and behavioral practitioners, we're always asking ourselves, and for those like you and Jez, recent authors, it's like how do we do what we were going to do, but in a totally virtual way. But you guys are, and you pulled it off. So kudos to you.
Thanks.
And so let's dig a little bit into the book. I've heard you say, and this is of course reflected in the book itself, that there's this mission at Cowry, and in the work you guys do, where you want to democratize the applications and insights of behavioral science. And I know actually that sort of has come up in conversation with Jez as well in the past on the show. But just to dig into that a little bit more as it's relevant to the book, why is that important to you guys, and how does that find its way in the work that you do with clients?
Yeah. Well, I think that something that's really important for us is that well, whenever we work with paying clients, for example, we're not we're not hoping that that relationship goes on indefinitely and they have to keep on paying us every single time that we help them solve a problem
Mm,
using behavioral science. I think what we try and do, and it can take, it takes several years to get to this stage. But you do an initial project, and everyone starts to see the amazing results that you can get from applying these really tiny nudges to have these really, really big ripple effects on the whole organization. And then bit by bit, through training the people in the company, they can start to do it themselves, and we kind of give them this toolkit
mhm,
that helps them start to apply it, everywhere in their role. And I think we all get quite a lot of gratification, me included, from seeing how our clients start using nudges on us in things like
mhm.
emails and stuff. So they really, really
Yeah.
embrace it. In fact, one of my clients it was my birthday last week, because I'm an April baby because I'm called April. And she's so into all of the behavioral science that she sent me a special behaviorally optimized birthday text to say, she kind of chunked it up into like 3 things that I should do today, and most people do this to use. Yeah, so it's quite nice to see how they really start to embrace it and make it their own. So I mean, that's yeah, that was where Ripple came in. Was that there didn't seem to be um, anything that kind of really fitted this mold, which was a book for people who read something like Nudge or Predictably Irrational and were left kind of thinking, um, what next? How do I actually go into work and start applying this stuff myself?
Mhm,
And it can seem quite. I'm sure it. Because you've been doing this for many years, you've got a process, and you've learnt loads of amazing little practical things for how you
mhm,
for how you go on that journey. But we just wanted to take all of the amazing insights from Jez's career and kind of bundle them all into this one place that would give people the tools to actually start doing it themselves.
mhm, mhm. I love that, and this has come up not just on the show, but in conversations with friends and colleagues and even clients. Is um, in science, not just like behavioral science, but just science writ large. It's in the spirit of to give it away, to give the
Mm.
knowledge away. Like it's totally counter to collect data and devise experiments, gather that knowledge, and to keep that knowledge to oneself. Even though that we sort of see that does happen often in, like, the ivory tower of academia. But in the spirit anyway, there's the principle that we should be giving our science, like I've heard this quote, to be giving our science away, especially a science of humans, where we can improve the the well-being and the welfare of citizens and customers and employees. It just makes so much sense that
Uh-huh.
we should be providing not just the knowledge, but in the case of Ripple and the work that you guys do, the sort of the toolkit and the methodologies and the frameworks and the approaches. So there's that which you guys are doing, and I'm very much aligned with that mission. And then there's also the opposite, which I see, and that's where you have, as change and behavioral science and behavioral insights has made its way from policy to for profit over the last few years. There are firms and agencies who are still operating in the old, I guess I'd call it the old way, where there's market competition and protecting their IP and all these sorts of things. And that to me seems to run counter to this spirit of open science and knowledge dissemination.
Yeah.
As you guys are a consultancy, a behavioral science consultancy, how do you sort of square those two things?
Oh, I think it's a really, really good point, Nick. And you can completely understand, can't you, why so many businesses wouldn't want to give away their trade secrets, because
Mhm.
if it gives them the competitive advantage, then why would they want all their competitors to know the thing that they're doing, which is giving them so much success?
Mhm.
And that's why it can feel like a bit of a black box, can't it? How behavioral science is being applied in business. And I think I was really aware of that when I was doing my masters in behaviour change at UCL in London. So it was an amazing department that was headed up by Susan Mickey, who was
Mm.
she and her colleagues wrote and devised the combi model and the behaviour change wheel. And it was an amazing course filled with a wealth of knowledge and insights about designing interventions, but they were all they were kind of bridging into the real world. There were loads of like academic, not academic. There were loads of health case studies, so about
Mhm.
how they'd been designing interventions in like hospital and healthcare settings. But I think what me and my classmates were yearning for were these examples of how it was being applied in the real world, and in particular the private sector, because lots of us had come from working in the private sector, um,
Mhm.
and that's what we were kind of interested in. And there kind of didn't seem to be there didn't seem to be much out there for us to digest that could kind of serve as inspiration for how you actually go about doing it in a really practical sense.
Mhm.
But yeah, to come back to your question, yeah, I mean it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because I mean, whenever I don't know if it's probably the same for you. When you start working with a client, um, that often you're signing confidentiality agreements, and you're signing agreements about where you're allowed to use their logo and what you can talk about and what you can't. So I think, I mean, usually the way we square up the sharing of amazing insights, but also keeping their privacy, is that
Mm.
we tend to talk about case studies without
Mhm.
using any company names, unless it's kind of in the
Mhm.
public domain already, or we've kind of got express permission. Because I mean, it is, yeah, you can understand why they don't want to give their secrets away.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, and as I was asking that question, I was like, I hope you're not taking it as like gotcha type of question. It is one that I think it's coming from a not a I wouldn't call it a place of concern for myself, but just something like, this is something that I think we sort of have to figure out as we grow this, fledgling field of ours, which is still very much in its infancy. But I look to you, guys, Cowry and other similar agencies and firms who are, on the consultancy and private side, and doing sort of finding that, I think, finding that balance, right?
Yeah,
And so that's a good thing, because this piece came up a couple weeks ago, and it was I think in Vox and on McKinsey, and like the classic MBB firms, and I wrote a small response to it, and my question was, as we grow as a behavioral science consultancy field, are we destined to become another McKinsey or another BCG, or is the talent of behavioral scientists and behavioral practitioners just going to end up going to those firms, in addition to, like, say, some of the more boutique ones, and those firms, which they're already doing, are going to be building out, their BE practices. And I don't. I think I don't have an answer, and I'm just sort of standing back and looking at it and saying, okay, this is interesting. I wonder where this is going to go, because this is different. We're doing science, and so it is a differentiating factor between how it has been done in the past. Um,
yeah.
but I think you guys are doing a good job of it.
Yeah, I wonder whether we'll kind of keep this variety of different sources, like, so we have all these different boutique places, like you say, that kind of all specialize in their own thing, or whether it will kind of all become a lot more homogenized. I mean, I think with like the world of with the world of advertising, it definitely seemed that all of the kind of boutique places that specialized in one little area of advertising, they kind of over time, they definitely did seem to merge into these big beasts. But yeah, it'll be interesting as well to see what happens, within the businesses that we're helping right now. How they start to develop their own behavioral science teams, and whether they'll still. I mean, I think they probably, even if you do have an amazing team within your business who specialize in applying behavioral science, I still think there'll probably be a really valuable role for external consultancies to come in and kind of give that fresh perspective, and also that specialism that you might not be able to have if you're having to if you're kind of doing it only as part of your job within an organization. But yeah,
and I've seen that actually, firms doing that, where they're they have like almost like an academy, where the aim is to train up let's say graduates or young talented people who are coming into that world, and then running them through like a series of boot camps, and it's like, here you go, off you go, kind of like, as you were saying,
yeah.
you're a proud you're a very proud parent of your clients, and applying nudges. I think it's sort of a similar thing, where it's like, let's train them up, and then let's sort of say, okay, off you go into your own organizations, where you can be that voice internally within the organization to build up and to support these behavioral economics or behavioral science initiatives, and then having those conversations with the external consultancies and bringing them in with fresh eyes and a fresh look at things. So I think that's the way it's probably going to go, and that's the way that I see it. Going.
Yeah, absolutely.
Question about with Ripple, it's interesting, right? Like we had from 2008 to 2010, we had nudge, thinking fast and slow, predictably irrational, and then it was almost like the floodgates opened for the behavioral revolution, if we can call it that. And then on the publication side, things were sort of quiet. And then all of a sudden, I see Ripple and I see a few others coming out, and it's fantastic. It's like Start at the End with Matt Wallert and Rich Chataway's book. So it's almost like all of a sudden we're in this phase. We're in this next phase. And is it the behavioral wave 2.0? Where do you guys see that as Cowry and the book itself fitting in?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting observation, and I wonder why that is. I wonder whether it's because of that shift that you were talking about so nicely earlier, about how academics are all about the spirit of sharing, whereas businesses tend to be much more of a closed book. So I wonder whether it's just it's taken longer for the applied practitioners to open up, because of that kind of culture of kind of keeping things to yourself. But yeah, I mean, we've kind of at the beginning of Ripple, we kind of talk about the context that the book sits in, and where it kind of comes in this journey, and we kind of talk about these three major stepping stones in the evolution of behavioral science as we've seen it. So, all of the amazing work in academia that started from the 1970s. This is kind of what we talk about as being the first wave, amazing leaps, but not yet starting to be applied in the real world. And then with nudge, as you mentioned, in 2008, this is when it starts to be applied in the world of policy, mainly, and political contexts, and I mean, yeah, I think this is this kind of third wave of it's kind of just starting to hit the mainstream now, and I mean, I don't know about you. I don't know whether you've got any Google alerts on your emails set up for behavioral science and behavioral economics, but I used to get
Mm-hmm.
maybe one or two new things would drip in every day at some point. But now it's like 30, 40, 50 different things every day dripping in, and I think that it's undoubtable that it's in the limelight now more because of the situation with coronavirus.
Mm-hmm.
And it could go one or two ways, really. I think it's if the consensus was that the UK government have quite publicly been using a lot of behavioural science to inform their strategy and their approach. And if we come out the other side of this and the consensus is that it was detrimental to our approach using behavioural science, we could be in a really interesting situation where the reputation of behavioural science is kind of blown a bit in the same way that the Cambridge Analytica scandal started to threaten to. Or we could come out the other side of this with a much better profile for behavioural science. More people than ever know about it, and it means that people will have more confidence in using it to make the most of it in business. And I think we're hopeful that it will be for the better. At least for the clients that we've been helping with in the thick of the coronavirus crisis over the past month, because it's just been such a valuable tool for talking to customers and talking to employees in this really tricky time. So I think it'll be really interesting to see how coronavirus just shapes people's lay people's perception of us.
Yeah, I think I see sprinkles of it here and there, and I think at the beginning of this whole thing, which it feels like 10 years, even though it's only been a couple months. At the beginning of that period, it was I kind of had an oh shit moment, like, oh gosh, like, is this it for us? Like, have we had our moment? But I was quickly that initial intuition was quickly overridden because, like you said, it's popular media, it's people appearing in the media as behavioral practitioners, it's governments. Behavioral practitioners advising governments and health officials, and I do believe like we have a change in this, and it's not surprising, right? It's like how the question is, how do you get en masse a large number of people to change their behavior in an instant, in such a quick short period of time?
Yeah,
That is the question of behavioral change and behavioral science. So it's no wonder that we are sort of in the limelight right now, and I that's that, and then on the organization side of, like, say, customer experience and employee experience, I think what we're seeing now, and what I'm seeing in conversations with clients, is this is almost like opened up a view. It's almost exposing human nature. And in this case, it's exposing, like, what do we want our work to be? What do we want our work to look like? What do we want our employees to do? And how should we be treating our customers? If we're sort of on the employee and on the customer side. And I think those questions were always there, but if you didn't have that behavioral science bent, or if the senior leaders didn't have the mandate or the budget, then it was sort of brushed off and not considered as important. But now, I think because of everything that's happening, these questions are coming to the forefront, and so they're asking these questions, and they're going, that's interesting. How do I answer that? And then we come in ever so cleverly and say, well, we've been doing this for a while, and we actually have an approach. We have a framework, and let's let me tell you about it.
Yeah, it's almost forcing
good.
companies to put customers at the heart of what they're doing, rather than just saying that that's what they're going to do.
Not just lip service anymore.
Yeah, how have you been affected, and your work? Have you noticed any kind of positive changes, or has it been quite tricky?
Yeah. I'd say both. I'd say 30. No, actually, I always put things in percentages. So I'd say about 30% tricky and 30% bad change, and
That's
then
pretty good.
70%. good change.
Okay, yeah, that's pretty good split.
And I'd have to say that because I sort of have a main client I work with on a more recurring and on a retainer basis, and
Right.
they just responded to this whole thing in such an amazing way
Yeah.
that what that, and they sort of brought everything digital, and their digital strategy was basically just amplified and brought to the front because of everything happening, and part of that digital strategy for them was a sort of a behavioral design and behavioral science application.
Hmm.
So that was good for me, and but they just did it in such a compassionate and human centric way,
Mm.
which is nice. And I think I think this of the behavioral field is we do things for good. You always hear, like, behavior change dot 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 for good, and I use that in my own work. And I think, going back to your point of like upholding our positive reputation out there in the market and in the world, I think if we can show like you can do behavior change for good, then that's going to help our case moving
Yeah,
forward, for
yeah,
sure.
yeah,
So let's pivot a little bit, and talk more about you and your background as a behavioral practitioner. You have this training, as I've known before, but I pulled it in your introduction, in like evolutionary psych, and
yeah.
facial perception. And I did a lot of my training in my graduate school was rooted in evolutionary psych
Oh, amazing.
and emotion. So I always
Yeah,
like see, even now, like, evolutionary psych is a tricky thing.
yeah.
But even though in the work that I do now, I'm always going back to like evolutionary or functional type explanations to make sense of decision making and heuristics and biases and
Hmm.
all these sorts of behaviors that we do, and these weird quirky behaviors. And I'm always finding myself applying an evolutionary type analysis.
Mm.
um, Curious if you have this background as well. Do you do the same, or are you missing the evolutionary psych
Oh no,
in this?
absolutely. Yeah, I do that. Yeah, in everything. I mean, mainly in my personal life, actually. Probably, I'm applying evolutionary
Yeah.
psychology to try and explain things. Um, I mean, yeah, I kind of ended up doing psychology accidentally. So I don't know if you've got the same system um, across across the pond, but when you go to university in Scotland, which is where I went to university, you apply to do one thing, but then you've kind of got the freedom to end up doing something completely different. So I
Hmm.
started doing maths, and I just kind of took psychology as like a side module, and I just kind of happened upon um, this amazing field that we like know and love, and evolutionary psychology is what the department at St Andrews just happened to specialise in, and it really resonated with me. And yeah, you mentioned the psychology of facial perception. So one of the labs at St Andrews is all about it's dedicated to studying how we perceive faces. And one of the ones that really caught my imagination when I was an undergrad was this really interesting finding that they'd studied, which was that we basically use skin color as a heuristic for health, which kind of makes sense when you
Hmm.
think about it. But they got this really robust finding that people find the opposite sex more attractive if their skin is yellower. So they basically
Hmm.
showed guys um, these pictures of women with various levels of yellow skin pigmentation, and they're consistently saying that the women with yellower skin was more attractive. And the way they got them, they actually got these women's skin to get yellower was by getting them to eat at least 5 portions of fruit and veg every day for like 6 weeks. So they got them into the lab
Wow.
and they took pictures of them. and they looked very pasty because they were at university in Scotland and there was no sun. So, so they didn't look very healthy. But I'm sure they were very stunning because everyone at Andrew seemed to be stunning. And then they said, go away. Just you've got to make sure that you eat 5 portions of fruit and veg every day in order to be part of the study. And then they got them back in, and they took their photo again. They had really high tech kind of facial photography studio in this lab. It was pretty cool. And then they did this study where they let guys move this slider across a screen, and you could kind of play around with the skin color of women's faces, and they were consistently going for this much yellower skin. And it kind of makes complete sense when you kind of rationalize it using evolutionary forces. So if you eat lots of fruit and veg, if you have an abundance of fruit and veg, there are these pigments called carotenoids in them, and if you have an abundance of carotenoids, it starts to deposit in your skin. So it's this really reliable indicator of having a really good diet. So yeah, I was there. I was really interested in that finding, and I went to the head of the lab, and I said, I've been thinking, lots of girls, they're using fake tan before they go on a night out. I've got this hypothesis that people are using this fake tan to kind of simulate this health. So I did some research on how close this fake tan pigmentation was to this fruit and veg skin coloring, and it wasn't quite the same. It kind of approximates it. So it was a really interesting time, and I'm still really interested in the psychology of what people find attractive in a mate.
And I mean, you can see the relevance, like even like with user experience and customer experience and basic things like web design and the type of images you use. And I could just see like a bunch of little mini tests that you could run to optimize a certain customer experience, let's say. And that I actually was familiar. I am familiar with that study, but I had no idea that was, you were affiliated with that lab. Is it Parrott? Dave
Yeah,
Parrott?
David Parrott, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
He was such a
I come
character.
from, so the University of Toronto has a big facial perception. Nick Rule, he's there, and I think the whole facial perception people like live in this little world. And I had a good friend who was a postdoc, and he did his PhD at St. Andrews. So yeah, this small world.
Yeah.
And the whole yellow thing is so interesting, the yellowness. And when I first heard it, I was like, my initial thought was yellowness. Isn't that like jaundice, which would suggest like an indication of malnutrition and a lack of health. But maybe there's a follow-up study, if it hasn't been done, is like, what is the yellowness difference between a healthy diet versus being jaundiced?
That is a really good point, Nick, and I think that was being done whilst I was there. I don't know what they found, but I remember what they were looking at was so I think if I remember rightly, that if you've got jaundice, you also get colouring of the whites of your eyeball. So I think that might be the thing they were looking at. So then if your eyeballs are yellow and your skin's going yellower, then that's that's not attractive. But
those are the cues, the sort of combined cues that they pick up, I guess.
Yeah.
Exactly. As I'm thinking about this, as I'm hearing you explain it and talk it through, there is this sort of overlap between this very quote unquote basic academic work and the applied work we do in practice with customers and employee experience, such that how we make decisions, as we know in like system 1, and what guides the forces that guide our behaviors and our actions and what we feel are very often, if not in most cases, flying under the radar, and we have no idea. So if I see a face and I think, I consider that person attractive, there's no way in hell I'd be like, I think that person's attractive because they have just a perfect yellow tone to their skin. You know, they
Yeah.
must be eating a lot of fruit and vegetables. So that whole like calculus, that whole like brain computation that's happening is very much well, obviously it's an evolved response that we adapted millions of years ago, and it's doing its thing, in some part of our brain of the facial perception, and we have no idea that it's doing it or why it's doing it. At least most people. But it's as the work we do now, it's about understanding that, gleaning those insights, and then say optimizing an experience to improve some sort of scenario for an individual, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if you see that overlap there with this.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really, really good point. Yeah. And the way I'm sure you use a kind of a similar analogy when you're talking to people about it. But the way we talk about it at Cowry is we talk about, well, Spock, the Spock part of your brain, wouldn't be analyzing the yellowness of your skin, but the Homer might just find that very, very attractive. Yeah.
There you go. That's funny that the use of Homer there and yellow skin.
Yeah.
So, and then actually, this is, I don't know if you thought about this, but there's this biases and heuristics. We always hear these things being thrown around and discussed in our work. I know with Kahneman, the angle that they take with biases is that they're bad, or that there's some sort of they're a bug in the design. Whereas I know other folks like Gerd Gigerenzer, and from an evolutionary approach, there's this amazing researcher named Marty Hazelton and her team, and they have a couple papers, and I'll link to them in the show notes, where they basically make the argument that this isn't a bug, this is actually a feature of our cognitive machinery and neurobiology.
Mhm.
That if you apply an adaptationist or an evolutionary argument to these heuristics, they're not a flaw. They're actually something that's really smart,
Mhm.
and that they helped us to survive and thrive as a species over the last tens of millions of years.
Mhm.
And it's just so happens to be in this more contemporary environment, which is an environment that's totally different than the one in which we involved these processes, where they sort of run amok and work against us. Have you thought about that with the sort of framework of biases and heuristics?
I mean, yeah, I think it's a really, really good point, Nick. I mean, more often than not, um, these mental shortcuts, I mean, they save us time and energy, and in that sense, they are really adaptive. I mean, I've been really conscious in the past few weeks, where my routine and way of working has been completely turned on its head. And it's just exhausting, even though you're kind of not, you don't feel like you're doing that much. Your commute is kind of 5 paces from your your bed to the kitchen table. You can spend all day sitting down if you want to, but then at the end of the day, I don't know whether you've been feeling this, but it can be really exhausting, and I
Yeah.
think it must partly be because we're not able to rely on all these shortcuts that we've kind of built up um,
Hmm.
throughout our daily lives. But
Hmm.
yeah, for sure, I do think that um, biases and heuristics can be adaptive. I mean, when you were saying that, because I was kind of still in the frame of mind of the facial perception days, it was bringing to mind another example that I don't know if you're familiar with, of one mental shortcut that's particularly adaptive. And I can't remember who did the study, but it was just such a beautiful and elegant study in a real world context. And I think what they were kind of setting out to see was whether guys had a kind of subconscious um, intuition about when women were most fertile, because that would be a
Hmm.
really, really adaptive shortcut. Um,
Yeah.
if they know when women are most fertile, then they can make the most of that. And they did this study where they just they went to a strip club, and I think they just tracked the women and their tips, and they found that men gave them way more tips when they were ovulating than when they weren't. So that, I mean, I think that's a perfect example of a subconscious mental shortcut, which is very adaptive. I mean, not one that I think we can apply in our work, unless you were.
I'm sure there's certain clients.
I'm sure.
Well, so I have to tell you, this is years ago now. So you're bringing it up. We're really going back in our time, which is great. So I really, I think this was like halfway through my PhD. Just some collaborators who my advisor knew, they were doing this work. They're sort of the leading group on this, what's called the ovulatory shift hypothesis.
Right. Yeah.
And the changing psychology of both women and men as a result of pre, during, and post ovulation, as a result of the different hormonal and endocrine fluctuations. So yeah, I was into that, and I ran a few studies to see whether that had an impact on a woman's ability to self-regulate and exercise self-control. And it was just such an impossible study to run, because if you want to do it really, really, really well, you have to give these tests, basically a P test. And I had to sort of organize of course, it was a fully randomized controlled trial, and a control condition and experimental condition all within subjects. And I had to bring these young women into the lab, and my research assistants had to walk them through. It's like, here's your test. You use it. Here's a bunch of tests. Use it every single day. Email us the results. Anyways, it was just such a near impossible study to run. And by the end of it, I was like, and the data were a little bit all over the place, because it was a neuro study. And I said, forget it. I'm abandoned. I'm
done
getting rid
with
of
women. I'm done with women. Just give me men to study any day. They're much simpler. That's so interesting.
You said it, not me.
What did you find?
So we ran first an online study through Amazon's Mechanical Turk, or what we call MTurk. It's just like an easy, quick, and dirty way to get data for listeners who are wondering. It's often used by psychologists, marketers, economists. So we did that first, and that method, it's called the count method, where you basically ask a woman, when was the first day of your last, the start of your last period, and that counts as day 0. And then you assume an average. I guess I think you ask women, what is your average cycle length? And, I think the average is 28 days. And then you do this reverse calculation method to assume, okay, it's this is day 13. This is the peak, because it's usually a 2-day window. This is the peak fertility when they're ovulating. And then we would give them different cognitive reaction time tests and different emotional tests to see the difference between pre and during ovulation. So that was one. And we found evidence that there was an increased level of self-control, cognitive control. And then we wanted to do a more robust follow-up in the lab, where we had the P tests. And when we did that, we actually found the opposite. There was less cognitive control. And then we followed it up once more with the neuro study. And that was just a mess. And so I was like, I've learned nothing about this other than it's really difficult to run these types of experiments.
It's interesting though, isn't it? Because I mean, you learned nothing that could be published in a nice glossy paper, but you did still learn really valuable things. And I always kind of struggled with that a little bit when I was in a more academic world, which is, all of the really useful stuff that's been learnt by academics that then doesn't really get out there and doesn't get shared because of the way that we kind of only prize a statistically significant result, and it's all about that p-value. And I wonder whether it's kind of the same with how we apply behavioral science and business, where we could actually all benefit if we kind of came together and shared not only what works but also what doesn't work. If someone's tried it, it's kind of a shame that someone else has to then go through and maybe kind of make that mistake again.
Yeah, you could save, and I know there are initiatives, and I can't think of off the top of my head, but I've had conversations over the years of people being like, "We need this," and I think there's people working on it, but it doesn't come to mind right now. But I'll try and dig it up and put it in the notes, because you can imagine like you're having a yeah you conversation with a client, and they explain the problem, and you do some sort of behavioral diagnostic, and then you say, okay, well, here we have five possible alternative solutions, which you then build a set of experimental tests, and you run your RCTs. Well, if you know, if it's common open source knowledge that the three of the five don't work in that particular context because some other group has tried it and it sort of had a backfire effect, or it was a null effect, well, then you've just saved yourself a lot of time, and you've saved your client some money as well, which would be value add in working with those businesses. But you're right, it's what's called in academia the file drawer problem, which is you only publish the quote unquote positive results.
Yeah.
Um, so you see the 10 papers that demonstrate the positive effect of, oh, this thing exists. Meanwhile, little, unbeknownst to the scientific community, and obviously to the public, there are 205 negative studies sitting somewhere in a file drawer that never saw the light of day. And so now we're actually being exposed to a skewed um, source of knowledge and information, and we're making decisions based off that. So it's a huge problem, which contributed in part to the replication crisis in psychology.
Mhm.
And I think now us practitioners, we should sort of learn from that mistake of academics and say, we don't want the same thing either, because going back to that reputation of us doing good work and doing rigorous and robust work is and with credible work is knowing what works, and more importantly what doesn't. And
Yeah.
so doing all the things we need to do to prevent the file drawer, I guess,
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
us in
Absolutely.
practice.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know whether you've experienced this when working with other practitioners who are applying behavioural science, but for us at Cowry, part of the I wouldn't say problem, but one of the kind of quirks of the way we work is that all of that knowledge about what works and what doesn't work in any context is kind of in our heads, So
Mm,
after doing it for some years, it's really easy for us to look at an email that a company sent out and say, look, these are all the behavioural principles that's holding this email back, and these are all the heuristics and biases that I'd build in here to transform it and make it a really behaviorally motivating email.
mm,
But because all of that's kind of exists in our heads, what we've been doing recently is we've been working on a database that pinpoints what these most important factors are for business success, and kind of looking at how that changes across different sectors. So
mm,
what we've done is we've kind of collated all of our case studies and their results from like the last 4 years, and we've started codifying which of these behavioural factors drive the biggest impact. And it covers kind of lots of different applications of behavioural science. So there's websites in there and apps and contact centres, letters, emails, and even like physical stores. So
mm,
that's something that we're kind of in the process of doing right now, and we're really excited about kind of getting that done, because I think that'll kind of help us move away from that problem of having it all
mhm,
filed away in the
mhm.
filing cabinet, and kind of making it a lot more transparent.
Yeah, I love that. And this was one of the points I wanted to bring up with you. So I'm glad you brought it up. Is you guys are calling it sort of the C factor database, right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So I love that. And I see here, like, you guys are looking to apply some sort of, AI or machine learning set of algorithms so that you can optimize that experience. Is that sort of the direction you guys want to go with it?
Yeah, so I think eventually, what this might look like, I think coronavirus might put the brakes on it a little bit.
Hmm.
But I think what we'd like to get to is taking that knowledge out of our heads, and kind of creating some machine learning software that could essentially do what we do with our eyes with a first scan of something like a letter or an email or a web page. So I mean, it wouldn't be as detailed and intricate as if you were to look at it and go through it with a fine-tooth comb and all of the amazing knowledge that you've got stored away in your head. But what it would do is give you that kind of first read of, these are the areas that we're going to tackle, and these are some suggestions for what we do to make it better using behavioural science. Yeah. So yeah, watch this space. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, I love that. And I do believe that as we enter into this, if it's the third wave, let's say, into the 2020s for behavioral science and behavioral insights, is a really strong partnership between us and data scientists, so that we can build these sorts of databases and apply the different algorithms. And it's not to your point, it's not a replacing. I think I know humans are just far too complex to give everything to an algorithm to decide what is the best, if this then that nudge. I don't think it's going to be that easy, at least not
Yeah.
right now. But it can save us some time and some effort at the outset of a problem or a project. And to draw, there's some analogous cases of, I know, where AI is doing this type of work. So I have a good friend who works in I think he's like one of the like PwC or something like that. But he works in the legal department, and his whole job is to build these products, these AI-based products that scan legal documents that up until this point have been done by lawyers. And if we all know lawyers charge by the second, and their clocks are always ticking, and they're charging these exorbitant rates. But if you can cut those costs, and at the first pass, the first set of filters is run this through the computer, let the AI decide if it's sort of this or that, and then the human comes on in the second part of that process. I see something similar with our work.
Yeah. I think that's where we're hoping to get to. Yeah, exactly. So that we, the robots don't completely replace us. Fingers crossed. But they can help. Yeah, for sure.
That's great. Very cool. So yeah, we'll look out for that, and I'll link to it in the show notes so people can read a little bit more about it. Last question, April, if that's okay.
Sure.
So this is the BBB, or the Big Behavioral Brainstorm, which I ask all my guests at the end of each episode. So of all the issues and problems that we humans are facing right now in business or in society, in the world, which one would you think could stand to gain from a behavioral type intervention?
Oh yeah, it's a really good question, Nick. And I mean, I think right now it's probably got to be coronavirus for me, even though people are probably sick of hearing people talking about it. It's just like you said earlier, so much of the problem, almost all of the problem with its spread is people's behaviour. And I mean, I absolutely don't have the solutions, and I'm kind of only talking about this here as a layperson who understands behavioural science. But I mean, I don't know what it's like over in Canada, but in the UK, the police are kind of the ones responsible for breaking up the groups of people who are kind of congregating in parks. But I was chatting to someone earlier today, and she said that I think her and lots of her friends have seen the policemen themselves gathering in close groups and not maintaining the 2 meter distance that we're supposed to maintain. And there were in the UK every Thursday we're having everyone kind of stands out on their balconies or on their streets at 8 p.m. and claps for the NHS to say, we really appreciate what you're doing. And there were these photos circulating today of these big groups of policemen kind of congregating with the public on some of the bridges that go across the Thames, clapping for the NHS. So I mean, that's that feels like a huge problem from a behavioural science perspective, because they're the authorities. They're the people that we're all looking to model our behaviour on. So they're modelling this really poor behaviour, and it's kind of just part of the problem. And yeah, I mean, there's just there are just so many opportunities where it can be used. I mean, even just I don't know whether you read this on Quartz the other day, but there was a really interesting comment from someone, which I thought was really, really relevant for us, which is just the way that social distancing has been framed. So social distancing, it actually sounds really negative and antisocial, especially for extroverts. It's quite a bad frame to use for this positive behaviour that we want to encourage. And I believe it's a phrase that comes from epidemiology, social distancing. So, apparently in Singapore, they're framing it as safe distancing, which feels a bit nicer. And there's a psychologist at Stanford who suggested that we call it distant socializing instead, which is kind of another more positive frame that we could use. But yeah, the list feels endless for where behavioral science could be used to I mean, save lives right now. And I mean, I don't think that most of the time when we're optimizing customer and employee experience, we can say we are improving people's lives by removing frustrating experiences. But making things easier for people at this time and saving lives, it feels like the biggest opportunity for behavioral science right now for me.
Totally agree. And talk about ripple effects is such a small change in wording. So for I've heard changing social distancing to physical distancing, so that you're not putting emphasis on the social part, just more on the being physically separate. That's one word. That is literally one word. And who knows? Let's just say in a alternative parallel universe world, at the start of this, social distancing wasn't even mentioned at all to begin with, and there was a much more appropriate and sort of positively framed phrase that was used, like some of those that you mentioned, or physical distancing. I wonder what sort of downstream effects that would have had on people's decisions and behaviors to stay home or self-isolate or to do the practices that we need people to do. It's sort of crazy to think about just a single word change. And now we're seeing, I don't know if this just came out yesterday or a couple days ago, there's a Vox piece and a Guardian piece on some folks in Michigan are protesting, and they're gathering in the hundreds and even thousands to protest the stay-at-home order restrictions. So they're seeing it, of course, like personal liberty and freedom of which is highly valued and prized as an ethic in the individualistic society that is Western society, and in particular in the U.S. People are saying, "How dare you, government, tell me to stay home? Screw you! I have my individual rights. I'm going to go out." And that is, we can't. I look at that and I get frustrated, and I get really mad from just many different perspectives. And yet this is a huge portion. This is probably millions, tens of millions of people in the US and worldwide who believe this, and who are making the decision to not stay home because they feel it's in violation of their basic freedom. And so how do we guard against that? What do we do to mitigate those risks? You're right. It seems the puzzle is endless for us to do our work, and sort of maybe bringing this full circle, which is always nice to do on these shows. if this is our opportunity as behavioral practitioners to demonstrate the positive impact we can have. So for all of you government officials listening into this, you know where to reach out to get April and myself. Well, thanks, April. This has been great, and I kept you longer than I intended. So thanks so much for coming on and for sharing the insights from the book. And congratulations again to you and Jez.
Thank you so much. It's been my absolute pleasure, and thank you so much for having me.
Hey, Nick here once more. A final farewell note before ending. All the show notes, links to papers, resources, and materials mentioned in the episode can be found on the BS podcast page of The Behaviorist, where you can find all episodes and lots of other interesting, easy-to-apply, sciencey stuff. Just go to www.behaviorist.biz/BS podcast. And lastly, if you'd like to join me in the mission of spreading the good BS word, remember to rate and review the show on iTunes. Why should you? Because 1, you're a part of a digital-wide social proof exercise. 2, you're helping combat the negativity bias in the form of positive reviews. And 3, it's a little pre-commitment for your habitual podcast listening. A little investment to keep you coming back for more BS. I mean, how much more behavioral can you get? Thanks again for listening. Until next time, remember, keep your facts ugly and your hypotheses beautiful.